The family heard the door splinter before they saw the guns. 2 UZI submachine guns, to be precise, aimed at a terrified Ukrainian household in Boryspil on a February evening in 2006. The men wearing masks didn't waste time with introductions. They had one demand: everything valuable in the house immediately, or people would die. Within 12 minutes, they vanished with $150,000 in cash and a collection of gold jewelry that represented a lifetime of savings. The police report filed that night seemed straightforward enough. A brutal home invasion, probably local criminals, likely unsolvable given the professionalism of the operation. But investigators had no idea they'd just encountered their first direct evidence of a criminal organization led by a man who would torment law enforcement across 3 countries for the next 2 decades. A man who would be arrested 5 separate times, yet somehow keep walking free. A man who belonged to one of the most secretive and hierarchical criminal societies in the post-Soviet world. His name was Revaz Katamadze, though most knew him by his criminal aliases, Rezo or Magalo. And in 2006, he was just getting started. To understand how a single individual could orchestrate international crime rings, evade justice repeatedly, and build a criminal empire spanning from Russia to Germany, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to his childhood in the Georgian town of Zestafony, but to a secret ceremony that took place in Moscow in the year 2000. Revaz Katamadze was 26 years old when he received what members of the criminal underworld consider the highest honor. He was crowned as a thief-in-law. This wasn't some Hollywood gangster ritual. The title of thief-in-law emerged from Soviet prison camps in the 1930s and represents an elite criminal caste with strict codes, territories, and hierarchies that persist across the former Soviet Union and beyond. These aren't ordinary criminals. They're criminal aristocracy. The coronation process itself is deliberately obscure, conducted in secret gatherings where existing thieves-in-law vote on candidates. Acceptance requires unanimous approval, and the ceremony reportedly involves specific oaths, including promises never to work for the state, never to have a family in the conventional sense, and to contribute a portion of all criminal proceeds to a communal fund called the Obszczak. Once crowned, a thief-in-law becomes untouchable in the criminal hierarchy, commanding respect, settling disputes, and coordinating criminal activities across vast distances. In 2000, when Katamadze underwent this ceremony, he joined an exclusive club. At that time, there were perhaps only a few hundred genuine thieves-in-law worldwide. By accepting the title, he also accepted its consequences: a lifetime commitment to the criminal world with no possibility of legitimate retirement. Katamadze's coronation connected him to the Sukhumi Thieves clan, one of several major criminal networks with roots in the Georgian city of Sukhumi. This wasn't just a badge of honor, it was a business network. Membership meant access to criminal resources, protection from rivals, and the ability to call on other thieves-in-law for assistance across international borders. More importantly, it meant mentorship from established criminals who had already mastered the art of evading law enforcement while running profitable illegal enterprises. For young Revaz, that mentor was another Georgian criminal named Revaz Buknikashvili, known in the underworld as Peko or Peko Zestafony. The relationship between Peko and Magalo would become central to both men's criminal careers, demonstrating how the thief-in-law system operates as a mutual protection network that deliberately frustrates law enforcement. Peko Zestafony was already a legendary figure by the time he took Katamadze under his wing. Born in the same Zestafony region as his younger protege, Peko had spent more than 30 years cycling in and out of Soviet and post-Soviet prisons. He'd been crowned as a thief-in-law at age 26, The same age Katamadze would receive the title years later, suggesting this might be a traditional age for the ceremony. But Peko wasn't just surviving the criminal world. He was thriving in it, maintaining authority both inside prisons and outside them. In the thief-in-law hierarchy, Peko served as Katamadze's godfather, not in the Italian mafia sense, but in the specific terminology of this criminal culture, where established thieves sponsor younger ones, creating bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation. This godfather-godson relationship would prove crucial in 2006 when both men faced serious criminal charges. According to law enforcement records, when Peko was arrested for his involvement in an armed attack on a businessman's apartment, something remarkable happened. His godson, Magalo, confessed to the crime instead. Katamadze took the blame, protecting his mentor from prosecution. But the story doesn't end there, because within a short time, Peko used what investigators described as his administrative leverage, meaning corruption, bribery, or intimidation of officials, to get Katamadze released from custody. This mutual sacrifice demonstrated how thieves in law protect each other, taking turns accepting criminal liability while using their networks to minimize actual punishment. For law enforcement, it created an impossible situation. Even when they arrested these criminals, the system seemed designed to spit them back out. While his relationship with Peko provided criminal education and protection, Katamadze built his operational team closer to home. His brother, Revaz Katamadze, became his primary partner in violent crimes. Law enforcement files show the brothers working together on multiple occasions, but their collaboration on the Burglary home invasion of 2006 would ultimately draw the most attention. Unlike the hierarchical relationship between Peko and Magalo, the Katamadze brothers operated as equals, planning and executing crimes together. This family connection added another layer of loyalty to their criminal operations, blood ties that would withstand interrogations and prosecution attempts. When police eventually unraveled the UZI Robbery, they discovered that both brothers had participated, with Revaz as the organizer and Revaz as essential muscle. The February 2006 UZI Robbery wasn't spontaneous. According to Ukrainian law enforcement, this was a carefully planned operation by what they classified as a criminal group with international connections. The choice of weapons alone indicated sophistication. UZI submachine guns aren't standard equipment for ordinary burglars. These are military-grade weapons that require international smuggling networks to acquire. The rapid execution suggested the robbers had advanced intelligence about the victims, knew exactly what valuables were in the home, and had planned their escape route meticulously. The $150,000 in cash was too specific to be random. Someone had informed them that this particular family kept large amounts of money at home. The gold jewelry wasn't just grabbed randomly, but selected for value and portability. What made this crime particularly significant wasn't just its violence or the amount stolen, but what it represented. Revaz Katamadze, crowned as a thief-in-law 6 years earlier, was now actively leading criminal operations rather than just mediating disputes or collecting tribute. Some thieves-in-law maintain a quasi-legitimate profile, settling conflicts and managing criminal finances while avoiding direct participation in violent crimes. Katamadze chose a different path. He was hands-on, willing to orchestrate armed home invasions with his brother. This suggested ambition beyond just holding a title. He wanted to build his own criminal empire, using his status as a thief-in-law to facilitate operations, but not hiding behind it. The investigation into the UZI robbery moved surprisingly quickly by Ukrainian standards. Within months, police had identified the Katamadze brothers and other accomplices. By July 2006, pre-trial investigation had concluded, and the case was transferred to Boryspil City Court for prosecution. On paper, this looked like a success for law enforcement. They'd identified members of an international criminal organization, gathered evidence about a serious violent crime, and moved the case to trial. The Katamadze brothers faced charges under Article 187 of Ukraine's Criminal Code, armed robbery, which carried potential sentences up to 15 years in prison, with property confiscation. But anyone familiar with how thieves in law operate should have been worried. These criminals don't just have networks for committing crimes, they have networks for avoiding punishment. The case sat in Boryspil court for over a year. Then, in September 2007, something extraordinary happened that would allow Revaz Katamadze to escape justice and continue his criminal career for another 18 years. A senior judge at the court made a series of highly suspicious decisions. First, he accepted a motion from Katamadze's defense attorney to release the defendant on a signed promise not to leave the country, despite the serious violent charges and substantial evidence. Second, he ordered the case returned for additional investigation, creating a legal limbo that delayed any potential conviction. Third, and most damningly, he did all this without properly verifying medical documents that Katamadze's lawyers had submitted, without investigating their authenticity, and without properly attaching them to the case file according to Ukrainian criminal procedure. Even more bizarrely, the judge proceeded with hearings in a case that legally required the defendant's presence, but did so without Katamadze actually appearing in court. This violated Article 262 of Ukraine's Criminal Procedure Code, which explicitly mandates that defendants must participate in first-instance proceedings. Ukrainian prosecutors quickly recognized that these weren't innocent procedural errors, but deliberate sabotage of the case. Within weeks, they opened a criminal investigation into the judge himself, charging him under Article 364 of Ukraine's Criminal Code, abuse of office by a public official. The investigation would later reveal that the judge never verified basic facts about the medical documents, suggesting he either accepted bribes to release Katamadze or faced intimidation from criminal networks. But by the time prosecutors realized what had happened, it was too late. Revaz Katamadze had vanished. The moment he was released on that promise not to flee, he fled. Ukraine issued a domestic warrant for his arrest, which soon escalated to an international warrant through Interpol. Katamadze was now officially a fugitive from justice, wanted for armed robbery and violating the conditions of his release. For someone without resources, this would mean a life on the run, constantly hiding, unable to cross borders or live normally. But Katamadze wasn't without resources. He was a crowned thief-in-law with connections across the former Soviet Union, access to criminal funding networks, and a professional understanding of how to evade law enforcement. He disappeared into the criminal underground, and for months, Ukrainian police had no idea where he'd gone. The answer came from an unexpected direction: Russia. In 2008, law enforcement in Russia's Krasnodar region, a southern territory bordering both Ukraine and Georgia, detained a man matching Katamadze's description. When they verified his identity against international databases, alarms went off. This was the fugitive Ukrainian authorities had been seeking. Russia and Ukraine, despite their complex political relationship, cooperated on this case. Russian authorities arrested Katamadze and began extradition proceedings. For Ukrainian investigators, this seemed like redemption. The corrupt judge's decision had allowed the criminal to escape, but now international cooperation was bringing him to justice. In October 2008, Revaz Katamadze was extradited from Russia to Ukraine and immediately placed in pre-trial detention center number 13 in Kyiv. Ukrainian media reported the extradition with some satisfaction. The press service of Ukraine's main directorate for combating organized crime announced that the criminal authority known as Rezo and Magalo had been captured and would finally face trial. Katamadze was described as the leader of a criminal group with international connections, responsible for armed robbery under threat of automatic weapons. The case was scheduled to resume in Boryspil City Court, where it had originated before the suspicious judicial intervention. Prosecutors felt confident. They had their suspect in custody, they had strong evidence including witness testimony about the armed home invasion, and they had documentation of the judicial corruption that had allowed his initial escape. What they didn't anticipate was that the networks protecting Katamadze would activate again. The investigation into the corrupt judge was proceeding, but slowly. Meanwhile, Katamadze sat in detention awaiting trial. According to the Thief-in-Law Code, criminals who hold this title are expected to contribute to each other's legal defense, using the communal funds to hire lawyers, bribe officials, or intimidate witnesses. While there's no public evidence of exactly what happened behind the scenes, what's clear is that despite being caught, extradited, and held in a maximum security detention center, Revaz Katamadze somehow avoided a lengthy prison sentence. The details remain murky, likely deliberately so, but the outcome speaks for itself. This wasn't the end of his criminal career. It was barely a pause. The period between 2008 and 2020 represents a gap in publicly available information about Katamadze's activities. He wasn't constantly appearing in headlines, which suggests he'd learned from his earlier mistakes. Getting arrested for personally participating in armed robberies had drawn too much attention. A smarter approach would be to organize crimes while maintaining distance from the actual execution, using his status as a thief-in-law to coordinate other criminals rather than wielding weapons himself. This evolution from hands-on criminal to criminal organizer is common among thieves-in-law who survive their early careers. The title gives them authority to tax other criminals, mediate disputes for fees, and coordinate criminal activities without always being the one committing the actual crimes. During this period, Katamadze apparently attempted something that seemed contradictory for a career criminal. He tried to obtain legal residency in Ukraine. Despite being a Georgian citizen with a criminal record, despite having fled justice and been extradited, he somehow believed he could legitimize his presence in the country. This wasn't as unusual as it might seem. Many post-Soviet organized crime figures maintain a split existence, officially appearing as businessmen or ordinary residents while secretly operating criminal networks. Having legal residency makes it harder for authorities to deport you, gives you access to banking and property ownership, and provides a veneer of legitimacy that makes it easier to conduct both criminal and quasi-legal business. By 2020, Revaz Katamadze had apparently spent years living in Ukraine, possibly even obtaining some form of residency or citizenship status. But that year, Ukraine's migration service reviewed his case and made a consequential decision. They revoked any legal status he held. The specific grounds for this revocation weren't fully publicized, but the timing is significant. In June 2020, Ukraine's parliament had passed new legislation specifically targeting thieves-in-law and organized crime figures. This law gave authorities enhanced powers to sanction, deport, and prosecute individuals involved in organized crime hierarchies. The revocation of Katamadze's residency rights appears to have been part of this broader crackdown. Suddenly, a man who had been living relatively openly in Ukraine found himself stateless and facing deportation. Georgian citizenship meant he could theoretically be sent to Georgia, but Georgia also had outstanding criminal matters related to thieves-in-law. Ukraine could attempt to prosecute him for his old crimes, but the evidence was now over a decade old. The simplest solution from the government's perspective was deportation. Get him out of Ukraine and make him someone else's problem. For Katamadze, this created an existential crisis. Being deported could mean facing justice in Georgia, or worse, being sent to a country where rival criminal factions might target him. According to police reports, he responded by going underground, using what authorities described as various means of conspiracy to hide his location while remaining in Ukraine illegally. Law enforcement wasn't just sitting idle. On October 31, 2020, officers from Ukraine's national police conducted a raid on a country house in Kyiv Oblast. Their intelligence had pinpointed Katamadze's location, and this time they were determined not to let legal technicalities allow another escape. When officers entered the property, they found the 46-year-old Georgian criminal attempting to maintain a low profile in a rural area outside the capital. He was arrested without incident and immediately processed for violating Ukraine's immigration laws. Having lost his legal status and remaining in the country illegally made him subject to immediate administrative detention pending deportation proceedings. Ukrainian authorities prepared to send Katamadze to a temporary detention facility for foreigners and stateless persons in Volyn Oblast, a western region of Ukraine. This facility serves as a holding area for people awaiting deportation, not criminals serving sentences, but individuals whose presence in Ukraine is illegal and who are being processed for removal from the country. For law enforcement, this seemed like a clean solution. They didn't need to retry him for the 2006 robbery, didn't need to deal with potential corruption in the court system, didn't need to worry about criminal networks securing his release. They just needed to physically remove him from Ukrainian territory and ban him from returning. But what happened next demonstrates the fundamental problem Ukrainian authorities faced when dealing with thieves in law. In November 2020, shortly after his detention, a court reviewed Katamadze's case and made a stunning decision. They refused to authorize his placement in the detention facility and ordered his release. The legal reasoning wasn't entirely clear, but it appeared to involve technicalities about the deportation process, questions about where exactly he could be deported to given his stateless status, and possibly challenges to the evidence supporting his illegal presence. Whatever the specific grounds, the result was the same. Once again, Revaz Katamadze walked free, despite being caught by police. This pattern would repeat itself with increasingly frustrating regularity for Ukrainian law enforcement, setting the stage for the next phase of his criminal career, and the international manhunt that would eventually end in Germany. Ukraine's government had finally had enough. For years, thieves in law had operated with relative impunity across former Soviet territories, exploiting legal loopholes, corrupting officials, and building criminal empires while claiming to be legitimate businessmen. The cycle of arrest and release that characterized Katamadze's interactions with law enforcement wasn't unique to him. It was systemic. Prosecutors would build cases, police would make arrests, but courts would find procedural reasons to release suspects. Witnesses would suddenly recant testimony, and evidence would mysteriously become inadmissible. In June 2020, Ukraine's parliament decided to attack the problem at its source by passing comprehensive legislation specifically targeting the thief-in-law system and organized crime hierarchies. The new law didn't just focus on prosecuting individual crimes. Instead, it gave authorities power to sanction individuals based on their status as thieves-in-law or organized crime figures, regardless of whether they could prove specific recent criminal acts. This was controversial. Civil liberties advocates worried about sanctioning people for their associations rather than their actions. But lawmakers argued that the thief-in-law system itself was inherently criminal, that accepting the title meant swearing oaths to commit crimes and support criminal networks, and that traditional prosecution methods had failed for decades. The legislation passed, creating a legal framework for what would become the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in Ukraine's post-Soviet history. President Volodymyr Zelensky, elected in 2019 on an anti-corruption platform, took this seriously. His administration had been criticized for not moving fast enough against entrenched corruption and organized crime networks. The new anti-thief-in-law legislation gave him tools to demonstrate tangible action. On May 14, 2021, Zelensky signed a presidential decree that sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Personal sanctions against 557 thieves-in-law and 111 other criminal authorities. This wasn't symbolic. These sanctions meant asset freezes, travel bans, and authorization for law enforcement to arrest sanctioned individuals for deportation, regardless of their legal status in Ukraine. It was, in effect, a declaration of war against the entire criminal hierarchy. Revaz Katamadze appeared on that list as number 235. He was now officially designated as a threat to Ukrainian national security, subject to immediate arrest and deportation if found on Ukrainian territory. The list itself made for disturbing reading. Hundreds of names, mostly Georgian, Russian, and other former Soviet nationals, representing decades of organized crime operations across Eastern Europe and beyond. Some were notorious figures known to the public. Others were shadows, recognized only in criminal circles. The fact that authorities could identify 557 individuals who held this specific criminal title demonstrated both the scope of the problem and the intelligence work that had gone into compiling the list. For thieves-in-law accustomed to operating with relative freedom, the sanctions created immediate problems. Bank accounts started freezing. Property held in Ukrainian names became inaccessible. Border crossings became dangerous. Immigration officials now had explicit instructions to detain anyone on the sanctions list. Some criminals fled Ukraine immediately, heading to Russia, Georgia, or EU countries where they had established secondary bases. Others tried to fight the sanctions through legal channels, challenging them in Ukrainian courts as violations of due process. A few, perhaps overconfident in their protective networks, stayed and assumed they could continue operating as before. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Within days of the sanctions announcement, Ukrainian law enforcement launched coordinated operations across the country. On May 25, 2021, police in Dnipro arrested two of the most influential thieves in law operating in Ukraine, individuals known as Umka and Lasha Swan. In Zaporizhia, authorities detained a criminal called Prince, charging him with illegal weapons and narcotics trafficking. These weren't random street criminals, but high-ranking figures in the organized crime hierarchy. People who had operated openly for years. The message was clear. The sanctions list wasn't just paperwork. Ukraine was actively hunting these individuals, and their previous immunity was finished. Katamadze, having been released from detention just months earlier in November 2020, should have recognized the danger. He was stateless, already on law enforcement's radar, and now officially sanctioned by presidential decree. The smart move would have been to leave Ukraine immediately and establish himself in a country less focused on targeting thieves in law. But either through overconfidence, ongoing criminal business that kept him in Ukraine, or simply poor judgment, he remained in the country. Perhaps he believed that his previous releases from custody meant he had sufficient protection. Perhaps he thought the nationwide crackdown would focus on more prominent criminals and overlook someone like him. Whatever his reasoning, it was wrong. On May 28, 2021, Ukraine's security service, known by its Ukrainian acronym SBU, launched a special operation in the city of Strii in Lviv Oblast, western Ukraine. This wasn't ordinary police work. The SBU is Ukraine's premier intelligence and security agency, equivalent to a combination of the FBI and CIA in American terms. When the SBU targets someone, it means the case is considered a national security matter, not just routine criminal prosecution. Their intelligence indicated that two high-value targets from the sanctions list were in Stri, and they moved with precision. Officers descended on specific locations simultaneously, catching both targets before either could flee or alert the other. The operation netted two criminals. The first was Viktor Panyushin, a 62-year-old Russian citizen known in criminal circles as Vitya Pan. Panyushin was number 360 on the sanctions list and was also wanted by Interpol based on a request from Russian authorities. His presence in Ukraine while being wanted in Russia demonstrated how thieves in law often use the complex political relationships between former Soviet states to evade justice. Russia wanted him, so he stayed in Ukraine. Ukraine wanted others who were hiding in Russia. The second arrest was Revaz Katamadze, the 47-year-old stateless Georgian known as Magalo or Rezo, number 235 on the sanctions list. For Katamadze, this marked his fourth known arrest in 15 years: 2006, 2008, 2020, and now 2021. Each previous arrest had resulted in his release through court decisions, prosecutorial complications, or deportation proceedings that went nowhere. But this time felt different. The SBU wasn't local police who could be influenced or overwhelmed by procedural challenges. The presidential sanctions gave them clear legal authority to detain him, regardless of normal criminal procedure. And unlike previous arrests where he might have been held locally while cases developed, the plan now was immediate transfer to a detention facility specifically for foreigners and stateless persons, pending forced removal from Ukraine. The SBU announced that Katamadze would be transported to a temporary detention facility in Mykolaiv Oblast for processing. These facilities aren't prisons in the traditional sense. They're administrative holding centers where people awaiting deportation are kept. Conditions are harsh but legal. Detainees aren't serving criminal sentences, but are being held purely to ensure they can be physically removed from the country. For someone stateless like Katamadze, this created a legal puzzle. Where exactly would Ukraine deport him to? Georgia was his birthplace, but if Georgia refused to accept him, or if he'd renounced that citizenship, Ukraine couldn't force another country to take him. This legal ambiguity had protected him before, and his lawyers would undoubtedly exploit it again. The joint arrest with Vitya Pan highlighted another aspect of the thief-in-law world that law enforcement found particularly frustrating. These criminals know each other, cooperate across national boundaries, and maintain networks that transcend the post-Soviet political divisions. A Russian thief-in-law and a Georgian thief-in-law, both sanctioned by Ukraine, were found together in a small western Ukrainian city. They weren't there by coincidence. They were likely coordinating criminal activities, moving money, or planning operations that required face-to-face meetings. The arrest of both simultaneously delivered a blow to whatever they were planning, but it also demonstrated that despite government crackdowns, these networks remained active and operational. Media coverage of the arrests noted that both men had extensive criminal histories. Panyushin had been arrested in Ukraine previously in 2019, detained by the SBU literally as he walked out of a passport service center in Odessa, yet had secured his release shortly afterward. The pattern mirrored Katamadze's experience: arrest, detention, then release through legal mechanisms that seemed to consistently favor the criminals. Ukrainian journalists investigating these cases found evidence of judicial corruption, intimidated prosecutors, and what appeared to be systematic interference in cases involving thieves in law. The 2021 presidential sanctions and aggressive SBU operations represented an attempt to bypass these compromised normal channels by treating the issue as national security rather than ordinary crime. But while Katamadze sat in detention in 2021, a larger question loomed. Even if Ukraine successfully deported him, where would he go? And what would stop him from simply continuing his criminal career elsewhere? This is where his stateless status became both a vulnerability and a strange kind of protection. Being stateless meant no country was obligated to accept him, but it also meant he couldn't be easily tracked by any single nation's intelligence services. He existed in bureaucratic limbo, technically belonging nowhere, which paradoxically gave him freedom to operate anywhere he could physically access. The concept of a stateless criminal might seem like a modern invention, but it's actually a recurring problem throughout history. In the post-Soviet space, it became particularly common as new countries emerged from the USSR's collapse. Citizenship laws changed, and people found themselves without clear nationality. Some individuals became stateless accidentally through bureaucratic failures. Others, particularly criminals, deliberately rendered themselves stateless to complicate law enforcement efforts. If you have no official country, which government has jurisdiction over you? If you commit crimes in multiple countries, who can prosecute you? If country A wants to deport you, where does it send you if no other country will accept you? Katamadze's stateless status was officially confirmed in 2021 when Ukrainian authorities designated him as a person without citizenship. This wasn't just about lacking a passport. It meant that according to international law, no state recognized him as a national. Georgia could claim he was born there, but if he'd somehow renounced or lost Georgian citizenship, and Ukraine had revoked any status he'd obtained there, he was genuinely stateless. This created enormous complications for any deportation attempt. International law generally prohibits rendering people stateless or deporting them to countries where they face serious harm, and it requires cooperation from a receiving country. If no country would accept Katamadze, Ukraine was stuck with him, despite desperately wanting him gone. The November 2020 court decision to release him, despite his illegal presence, now made more sense in this context. Judges faced an impossible situation. Holding someone indefinitely without being able to deport them creates legal problems under both Ukrainian and international law. The normal procedure would be to hold someone for a limited time while arranging deportation. But if deportation is impossible, indefinite detention becomes legally questionable. Katamadze's lawyers had likely exploited exactly this legal gap, arguing that without a country willing to receive him, Ukraine had no legal authority to hold him in an immigration detention facility. It was a perverse outcome. His statelessness, which should have made him more vulnerable, instead protected him. Yet despite these releases, despite his stateless status providing legal complications, Ukrainian authorities kept coming after him. The cycle of arrest and release suggested that law enforcement and prosecutors understood they were fighting not just an individual criminal, but a systemic problem. Each arrest documented his presence, created legal records that could be used in future proceedings, and sent a message to other criminals that the government was actively pursuing them. Even if courts released him, the harassment itself had value. Constantly being arrested, detained, and processed made it harder for Katamadze to operate normally, forced him to spend money on lawyers, and kept him looking over his shoulder. The period between his May 2021 SBU arrest and what would happen next in his criminal career remains partially obscured. Ukrainian media stopped reporting on his case regularly, which could mean several things. He was successfully deported and the case closed. He was released again and went deeper underground, or he left Ukraine on his own to avoid the increasingly hostile environment. What's clear is that Ukraine's aggressive campaign against thieves in law was having an effect. By late 2021, Ukrainian officials reported that dozens of sanctioned criminals had been deported or had fled the country voluntarily. The constant pressure was working, at least in terms of pushing these criminals out of Ukrainian territory. But out of Ukraine didn't mean out of the criminal world. It just meant these thieves in law relocated to places with less aggressive enforcement. Russia remained a traditional haven for Georgian criminals, as Russian authorities often took a more tolerant view of thieves in law, seeing them as part of the cultural landscape rather than as threats requiring elimination. But by 2021, Russia was becoming more complicated for Georgian criminals due to political tensions between Russia and Georgia, plus Russia's own periodic crackdowns on ethnic Georgian crime groups. The European Union represented another option. Countries like Germany, Spain, and Italy had significant populations of former Soviet emigrants, creating communities where criminals could blend in while organizing operations. Germany, in particular, had become attractive to Eastern European organized crime by the 2000s. As a wealthy country with open borders within the Schengen zone, it offered criminal opportunities ranging from drug trafficking to financial fraud to organized burglary. German law enforcement had experience with Italian mafia groups, Turkish organized crime, and various motorcycle gangs, but less experience with the specific structure and culture of post-Soviet thieves in law. This knowledge gap created opportunities. Criminals who might be instantly recognizable to police in Ukraine or Georgia could operate more freely in Germany, at least initially, while local police learned who they were and what they were doing. Organized burglary rings became particularly profitable. Germany's relatively wealthy population, combined with the ability to quickly move stolen goods across open EU borders to be sold in other countries, made residential burglary attractive for organized groups. These weren't opportunistic crimes by individuals. They were systematic operations where teams of burglars would target specific neighborhoods, study residents' patterns to determine when homes would be empty, quickly extract valuables, and disappear across international borders before police could respond. The stolen goods, jewelry, cash, small electronics, anything portable and valuable, would be transported to other countries for sale, making them nearly impossible to trace. German police statistics showed apartment burglaries had become a significant problem in certain regions. While overall crime rates in Germany remained relatively low compared to many countries, property crimes, and particularly organized burglary, showed concerning trends. Law enforcement identified networks of criminals, often from Eastern Europe, who specialized in these operations. Some would enter Germany on tourist visas, commit a series of burglaries over a few weeks, then leave before authorities could identify them. Others established more permanent bases, using legitimate-seeming front businesses or family connections to maintain residence while organizing criminal activities behind the scenes. For a thief in law with decades of experience in organizing criminal operations, connections across multiple countries, and a need to relocate from Ukraine, Germany represented an ideal target. The wealth was substantial, the security often minimal compared to what criminals faced in post-Soviet countries, and the legal system, while functional, moved slowly enough that someone skilled at exploiting procedural delays could operate for extended periods before facing consequences. Most importantly, German police in the early 2020s didn't have extensive experience with thieves in law specifically. They understood organized crime, but the particular structures, codes, and international networks of the post-Soviet criminal world weren't as familiar to them as to Ukrainian or Georgian investigators. This knowledge gap meant that someone like Katamadze could potentially operate in Germany with less immediate recognition than he would face in Ukraine. While Ukrainian SBU officers would instantly recognize his name and criminal significance, German police encountering him might initially see just another Georgian migrant, one among thousands living legally or semi-legally in Germany. Unless specific intelligence connected him to active criminal operations, he could potentially maintain a low profile while organizing others to commit crimes. This was the evolution from direct participation to criminal organization, rather than personally conducting armed robberies as he had in 2006. He could now coordinate networks of burglars, taking a percentage of profits while remaining at a distance from the actual crimes. Ukrainian intelligence agencies had been watching these patterns for years. They knew that when they successfully pressured criminals to leave Ukraine, those criminals didn't retire, they just relocated. And they knew that without international cooperation, particularly with EU law enforcement, these criminals would continue operating across borders, exploiting differences in legal systems and information sharing. This is why, when Ukrainian intelligence began developing information about Katamadze's activities in Germany, they didn't keep it to themselves. They reached out to German counterparts, initiating the cooperation that would eventually lead to the largest organized crime operation in recent German history. The intelligence sharing between Ukraine and Germany represented exactly the kind of international cooperation that thieves in law had historically been able to avoid. For decades, these criminals exploited the fact that different countries didn't communicate effectively, that criminal records didn't transfer across borders, that someone wanted in Ukraine could live freely in Germany simply because German authorities didn't know who they were. But improvements in international law enforcement cooperation, particularly within EU frameworks and through organizations like Europol and Interpol, were closing these gaps. When Ukrainian intelligence provided German police with detailed information about a criminal operating on German territory, German authorities could act on it. According to reports that would emerge later, Ukrainian law enforcement described Katamadze as a 51-year-old Georgian national who was controlling organized criminal groups across the European Union. The specific operations he was suspected of organizing included systematic apartment burglaries in Germany and money laundering schemes to clean the proceeds from these crimes. The intelligence suggested this wasn't small-scale. Investigators believed he was coordinating multiple groups of criminals, organizing logistics for burglaries across different German states, and managing financial networks that moved money across borders to disguise its criminal origins. Money laundering was particularly crucial to these operations. Stealing jewelry and cash is one thing. Converting stolen goods into usable, apparently legitimate money is another. Jewelry needs to be sold, which requires connections to dealers willing to buy stolen goods without asking questions. Cash needs to be moved and deposited without triggering financial monitoring systems designed to detect suspicious transactions. Both processes require sophisticated networks, pawn shops, corrupt dealers, informal banking systems, and methods of moving money internationally without leaving obvious trails. For a thief in law with decades of experience and international connections, setting up these networks was entirely feasible. German police began their investigation quietly. Rather than immediately arresting Katamadze or raiding suspected criminal locations, they conducted surveillance, gathered evidence, identified other members of the criminal network, and built a comprehensive case. This approach takes longer but yields better results. Instead of arresting one person and watching the network scatter, investigators can potentially dismantle entire operations, arresting multiple people simultaneously and seizing financial records that document the full scope of criminal activity. The investigation expanded to cover 3 federal states: Baden-Württemberg in the southwest, North Rhine-Westphalia in the west, and Bavaria in the south. This geographic spread suggested the criminal network operated across a significant portion of Germany. As the investigation progressed, German authorities coordinated with Ukrainian counterparts who provided crucial background information. Ukrainian investigators could explain the thief-in-law system, Katamadze's specific history and criminal associations, his methods of operation based on previous cases in Ukraine, and intelligence about his known associates who might also be operating in Europe. This cross-border intelligence sharing transformed what might have been a routine organized crime investigation into a targeted operation against a specific high-value individual with international significance. By early 2025, German police were ready to move. They had identified Katamadze's location, mapped out his criminal network, documented connections between various criminal actors, and gathered evidence about specific crimes. The operation they planned would be massive. Not just a single arrest, but a coordinated strike against multiple targets simultaneously across 3 federal states. The goal was to arrest Katamadze, detain his key associates, seize evidence and assets, and completely dismantle the criminal organization he'd built in Germany. They scheduled the operation for March 26, 2025. March 26, 2025 began like any ordinary Wednesday morning across Germany. Commuters filled trains heading into cities, businesses opened for the day, and life proceeded with the orderly predictability Germans expect. But in police stations across 3 federal states, officers had been arriving since before dawn. Over 1,000 law enforcement personnel, state police, federal investigators, financial crime specialists, and tactical units were preparing for simultaneous operations that would unfold across Baden-Württemberg, North Rhine-Westphalia, and Bavaria. This wasn't a response to terrorism or a violent threat. This was Germany declaring war on organized crime networks that had been systematically looting apartments and laundering millions of euros while exploiting the country's open borders and relatively lenient initial responses to property crime. The scale of the operation was unprecedented for a case focused on burglary and financial crimes rather than drugs or violent offenses. Over 1,000 officers mobilizing simultaneously indicated that German authorities had identified an extensive criminal network with multiple locations, numerous participants, and complex financial structures requiring expert seizure and analysis. The coordination required to execute such an operation, ensuring all teams moved simultaneously so targets couldn't warn each other, that evidence was properly collected across multiple jurisdictions, that financial assets were frozen before they could be transferred, represented months of meticulous planning. At the center of this massive law enforcement effort was a 51-year-old stateless Georgian man whose criminal career had spanned 2 decades and 3 countries. Revaz Katamadze had apparently believed that distance from Ukraine would provide safety. After years of arrests and releases in Ukrainian territory, after being sanctioned by presidential decree and hunted by the SBU, relocating to Germany must have seemed like a fresh start. But he had fundamentally misunderstood how modern international law enforcement operates. The intelligence sharing between Ukrainian and German authorities meant that his criminal history, his methods, his associates, and his significance as a thief in law all came with him to Germany. Ukrainian investigators had been tracking Eastern European organized crime networks operating in the EU for years, watching as criminals they couldn't successfully prosecute at home set up operations in wealthier Western European countries. When they developed information about Katamadze's activities in Germany, they shared it immediately with German counterparts. What Ukrainian intelligence provided wasn't just a name and a criminal record. They gave German investigators a comprehensive briefing on how thieves in law operate, what organizational structures to look for, how these criminals recruit and manage subordinates, how they move and launder money, and what methods work for building cases against them. Ukrainian police had decades of experience fighting these networks. German police, while highly professional, had less specific experience with post-Soviet organized crime structures. This knowledge transfer proved invaluable. German investigators could recognize patterns in their own cases that matched what Ukrainian colleagues described, connecting seemingly unrelated burglaries to a coordinated network rather than treating them as separate incidents. The burglaries themselves showed clear signs of organization. German police had been tracking a pattern of apartment break-ins across multiple cities that shared common characteristics. Teams of 2 or 3 individuals targeting apartments in middle-class and upper-middle-class neighborhoods. Careful timing to ensure residents were absent. Rapid entry and exit, minimizing time on scene. And selective theft of specific, high-value items rather than random grabbing of whatever was available. These weren't desperate addicts stealing anything they could find. These were professionals executing planned operations with advanced intelligence about targets and systematic approaches to minimizing risk. The scale was staggering. While German police didn't publicly release exact figures about the number of burglaries they attributed to networks Katamadze allegedly controlled, the fact that over 1,000 officers were deployed to dismantle these operations suggested they were dealing with hundreds or potentially thousands of crimes. Each individual burglary might seem relatively minor, a few €1,000 in stolen jewelry, some cash, perhaps electronics. But multiplied across hundreds of incidents, the total financial impact reached millions. More importantly, these crimes shattered victims' sense of security in their homes, created fear in entire neighborhoods, and demonstrated that criminals could operate with apparent impunity across Germany's open internal borders. The organized nature of these burglaries required infrastructure. Criminals needed safe houses where they could gather before operations and divide stolen goods afterward. They needed transportation, often vehicles with license plates that couldn't be easily traced or that could be quickly changed. They needed information about targets, which apartments contained valuables, when residents would be away, whether security systems existed, how police patrol patterns functioned in different areas. They needed buyers for stolen goods, people willing to purchase jewelry and other valuables without documentation, pay in cash, and not report the transactions to authorities. And they needed financial mechanisms to launder the proceeds, converting stolen goods and cash into apparently legitimate funds that could be spent without attracting investigation. This infrastructure didn't emerge spontaneously. Building these networks required someone with organizational skills, criminal connections across multiple countries, access to criminal funding to finance initial operations, and authority to enforce discipline among subordinates. This is where the thief-in-law title became relevant. In the criminal hierarchy, a crowned thief commands respect and obedience that ordinary criminals cannot. When Katamadze told subordinates to conduct specific operations, they did so not just because of direct threats, but because refusing orders from a thief-in-law could result in being ostracized from the entire criminal world, losing access to criminal opportunities, and potentially facing violence from other criminals enforcing the hierarchical system. The money laundering component was equally sophisticated. Stolen jewelry couldn't simply be walked into legitimate pawn shops. German regulations require identification and documentation for precious metals and valuable items, specifically to prevent fencing of stolen goods. Instead, the criminal network apparently operated through a combination of corrupt dealers who would purchase items without proper documentation, underground markets where stolen goods could be sold to other criminals or exported to countries with less stringent controls, and elaborate schemes to disguise the criminal origins of cash and assets. Money laundering in the modern era requires understanding international banking regulations, knowing how to structure transactions to avoid triggering automated reporting systems, and having access to financial professionals willing to facilitate illegal transfers. German financial intelligence units had been tracking suspicious transaction patterns that suggested organized money laundering. Large cash deposits structured just below reporting thresholds, frequent international wire transfers to countries known for weak financial oversight, businesses with revenues that didn't match their apparent level of legitimate activity. All classic indicators of money laundering. When these financial patterns coincided with intelligence about organized burglary networks and Ukrainian information about a specific thief-in-law operating in Germany, investigators could connect the dots. The March 26th operation would target not just the criminals conducting burglaries, but the entire financial infrastructure supporting these operations. The geographic spread across 3 federal states, Baden-Württemberg, North Rhine-Westphalia, and Bavaria, indicated the network's scope. Baden-Württemberg includes Stuttgart and other wealthy southwestern cities. North Rhine-Westphalia contains major urban centers like Cologne, Düsseldorf, and Dortmund. Bavaria encompasses Munich and prosperous southern regions. Hitting all three simultaneously required extraordinary coordination. Each state has its own police force with distinct jurisdictions, requiring federal coordination through Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office to ensure unified action. The operation's complexity rivaled major counter-terrorism efforts, except the target was property crime and financial fraud rather than violent extremism. As the operation unfolded on March 26th, officers executed search warrants at dozens of locations simultaneously. They weren't just looking for stolen goods, though they certainly hoped to recover items that could be returned to victims. More importantly, they sought evidence documenting the organization's structure, communications between members, financial records showing money flows, ledgers documenting crimes and proceeds, and any materials that would prove the existence of an organized criminal enterprise rather than just individual unrelated burglaries. German law allows for enhanced penalties when prosecutors can prove crimes were committed as part of an organized group rather than by individuals, making this documentation crucial for serious prosecutions. The raid's scale sent shockwaves through Germany's Eastern European criminal communities. Over 1,000 police officers conducting simultaneous operations wasn't normal for property crime cases. This level of response indicated that German authorities had decided to make an example, demonstrating that they would devote massive resources to dismantling organized crime networks, regardless of whether those networks engaged in violent crimes or merely property offenses and financial fraud. The message to other criminal organizations was clear. We know you're here. We're working with international partners to identify you, and we will mobilize overwhelming force to shut you down. For Katamadze personally, the March 26th operation represented the culmination of 2 decades of evading justice. He'd escaped prosecution in Ukraine multiple times through corrupt judges, procedural technicalities, and the complications created by his stateless status. He'd been arrested and released so many times that he'd perhaps begun to believe he was untouchable, that the system would always find a way to let him go. But Germany's legal system operated differently than Ukraine's often compromised judiciary. While corruption exists everywhere, German courts generally function with greater independence and less vulnerability to criminal influence than their Ukrainian counterparts. The safeguards that had protected Katamadze previously wouldn't necessarily work here. German authorities announced the operation's success on April 3, 2025. In a press release, the National Police of Ukraine, working in cooperation with German law enforcement, revealed that one of the most influential representatives of Russian-speaking organized crime abroad had been arrested in Germany. They identified him as Revaz Katamadze, nicknamed Magalo, a thief-in-law who belonged to the Sukhumi criminal clan and appeared as number 235 on Ukraine's sanctions list of 557 thieves-in-law. The announcement confirmed that he was suspected of organizing criminal groups engaged in apartment burglaries across Germany and laundering illegally obtained funds through various financial schemes. The timing of the announcement, a week after the actual March 26th raids, reflected standard law enforcement practice of conducting operations first and publicizing them only after initial evidence analysis and processing of arrested individuals. This delay allowed investigators to assess what they'd seized, identify any additional suspects who might not have been captured in the initial operation, and ensure that public announcements wouldn't compromise ongoing investigative leads. The Ukrainian National Police's involvement in the announcement demonstrated the international cooperation that had made the operation possible. Without Ukrainian intelligence about Katamadze's background, methods, and significance, German police might not have recognized how important he was or how extensively organized his networks were. The press release specified that he was 51 years old at the time of arrest, which aligned with his birth year of approximately 1974, based on earlier reports that he was 26 when crowned as a thief-in-law in 2000. This detail confirmed that investigators had properly identified their target, not someone using his name or identity, but actually Revaz Katamadze himself. The mention of the Sukhumi Thieves clan placed him within the Georgian criminal hierarchy, indicating to knowledgeable observers that this wasn't just any criminal, but someone with significant status and connections within the organized crime world. The reference to him controlling criminal groups in the plural, not just a single gang, suggested the network's scale exceeded what would typically be attributed to an individual burglar or small-time criminal. Katamadze's arrest in Germany marked at least his fifth known detention since 2006. The initial arrest for the UZI robbery, the 2008 extradition from Russia, the October 2020 detention in Kiev Oblast, the May 2021 SBU operation in Stry, and now the March to April 2025 German operation. Each previous arrest had resulted in his eventual release through various legal mechanisms. Would Germany be different? German courts operate independently from political pressure, but they also follow strict legal procedures that defense attorneys can exploit. Katamadze's lawyers would undoubtedly challenge the evidence, question the legality of surveillance methods, argue about jurisdiction and extradition issues, and use every available legal avenue to secure his release or minimize potential punishment. The final irony of Katamadze's career was that the same international connections that initially protected him ultimately contributed to his downfall. His status as a thief-in-law gave him authority, resources, and networks across multiple countries, enabling his criminal success. But it also made him a priority target for Ukrainian authorities, who included him on the sanctions list precisely because of that status. The international nature of his operations required him to cross borders and work with criminals in multiple countries, creating exposure points where intelligence services could track him. The money laundering necessary to profit from his crimes required financial transactions that left trails. The scale needed to make serious money required organization and subordinates who could potentially inform on him. Everything that made him successful also made him vulnerable once authorities decided to prioritize his case and cooperate internationally.